everybody, it's Mr. Wagstaff. Cool stuff to talk about today. So today we're going to start talking about some innovations that are taking place in the United States here at the late 1800s, moving into the 20th century. And then we're going to start talking about the discrimination and some of the segregation and Jim Crow laws that are taking place in the South at the turn of the century. Let's go ahead and get started. So let's start today talking about some innovators and some innovations that are taking place in the United States that is really fundamentally going to change the lives of a lot of Americans. So one of the first things, which may not seem that crazy, is the creation of skyscrapers. Because we had talked about the concept of the Bessemer process created by Henry Bessemer, where they can take iron and turn it into steel. Steel is astronomically better than iron in pretty much every single category. For that reason, you can now make buildings taller. This is the Wainwright building in St. Louis, which is one of the very first skyscrapers. And by today's standards, this is not considered a skyscraper. But this would have been very difficult to make with just steel and concrete. Or just iron and concrete. They most likely could have, but the sturdiness and the cracking it and things like that would have caused issues. But with the creation of steel and the easy access to steel now, thanks to, obviously Carnegie is selling it everywhere, it's easier to make. You can now start making buildings that are going higher with the use of steel. This is how you build these steel skyscrapers. And they're absolutely enormous. If you've ever been to a big city, they go up forever. And the technology hasn't changed since the 1800s to present day. It's still based on steel, which is much lighter and stronger and flexible than iron. But yeah, the people who go make these skyscrapers is crazy. This picture is a very famous picture. It's called Out to Lunch. But this, I think, was actually taken in 1931. So it's a little past the time frame. But again, I guess there's no need for safety equipment, because if you fall, there ain't no safety equipment going to help. Anyway, this still, either this is a really cool picture to you or it's terrifying to you. All right. So the use of steel has allowed cities to basically grow up, can now allow cities to be more densely populated, since you can now make taller buildings and more people can live and work in the same buildings. The next one, big innovation that's going to change America, are these two guys, Orville and Wilbur Wright. So these two guys, usually collectively referred to as the Wright brothers, and if you're in North Carolina, you're probably familiar with these guys. These are the guys that went to Kitty Hawk at the beach and flew an airplane for the first time, which is true. And this is actually a picture of their airplane they flew for the first time. Couple interesting things about this story. So Orville and Wilbur Wright aren't from North Carolina. They're actually from Ohio. So they had a bicycle shop, which at the time, at the turn of the century, a bicycle shop, because there's a lot of science and physics involved in bicycles that had become real popular, kind of a niche culture at the time. It kind of shows that they were very intelligent engineers and inventors. So they had created an airplane. The problem is every time anybody else had ever tried to fly an airplane, and let me back up when I talk about them inventing an airplane. Leonardo da Vinci, hundreds of years before, understood the science behind it. Nobody had an engine strong enough to have a plane fly. Leonardo da Vinci actually invented the helicopter. He just couldn't make it because he didn't have an engine to power it. So the science had been there. The trick to an airplane is you got to get going really fast in order to take off. Well, there was no engine at the time strong enough to pull a plane down a runway. So what a lot of people did when they're trying to see if their plane flew, they just jumped off a cliff with it. Again, if you're the first guy that's trying to learn how to fly, probably you are a risk taker. So Orville and Wilbur Wright were like, yeah, we can jump off a cliff with it too. We just don't want to land in a ravine at the end. So Orville and Wilbur Wright build this plane, and they decide that they want to take off and not die if it crashes. So they want to jump off a cliff, but land in something soft. A great place to do that would be at the beach. You jump off a sand dune, and if it crashes, you're landing in the sand. A much higher chance of surviving than falling to your death off a mountain. The problem is they're in Ohio. There is no beaches in Ohio for these sand dunes, so they pack it all up. Their plane. They travel across the country to North Carolina to the Outer Banks where it's very windy, which is going to help them. They have sand dunes. It's the perfect environment. They fly. It is successful. I think the first flight lasts like about a minute, which is still sustained flight is a crazy, man's always wanted to fly. We're going to fly one day, and they're able to do it. There's reporters there. Everybody sees it. They land it. Everything is fantastic. Then they pack it all up, and they go back to Ohio. Because they basically did this on a vacation in North Carolina likes to take credit for this situation of being the first ones to fly. Literally, North Carolina's license plates say first in flight. Ohio is like, wait a minute. These guys are born here, raised here, learned how to build airplanes here, built the airplane here, just took a vacation to test it in North Carolina, and then came back to Ohio. And so Ohio, on their license plate, says birthplace of aviation. And there is still, to this day, a little squabble between North Carolina and Ohio over who gets to claim this right for the first people to fly, which is Orville and Wilbur Wright. But it's kind of interesting. Once flight takes place, it's kind of like, hooray! Now what? And you would think once you can fly, everybody would really focus on airplanes and airplanes really take off. That's really not going to happen. It was kind of like when we went to the moon. High five everybody when we went to the moon. Now everybody just goes home and forgets about it. That's an issue for airplanes because once they fly, everybody's like, cool, we did that, check that box, moving on. We don't need to improve it. It's not until World War I when they're like, let's put a machine gun on it, that the technology in the airplane gets better. All right. Let's talk about another innovator at the time. All right. So there is this guy named George Eastman. All right. So George Eastman is going to invent a new type of camera. So let me back out of the picture here. This is what the top level cameras were at the turn of the century. They were big. They were bulky. It took multiple people involved. It cost a bunch of money to have your picture taken, even though they had flash photography out, as we talked about with Jacob Riis, which I should not jump ahead. Jacob Riis is actually using one of George Eastman's cameras. So I am kind of jumping ahead. But George Eastman invents a camera that is much smaller than the one pictured here. This is the camera that he makes. It's itty bitty. You have a little flash on top of it. It's instantaneous. You just hit a button and it takes a picture. So instead of having like a 2-man crew to take a big picture and it takes all day to get everybody set up and you have to pay these photographers hundreds of dollars to come out and take a picture of you, it's almost instantaneous now in order to take these pictures. So George Eastman thinks he's going to make a ton of money selling these simple cameras to the photographers, and they don't have to do all their work anymore. Well, all the photographers see how easy it is to take a camera, George Eastman's new camera, and they refuse to buy his camera, trying to put him out of business. Because they're like, oh my gosh, we charge people $100 to take their picture. If they see we just show up and go, click, and then walk off, nobody's going to want to buy a picture for $100 if it looks that easy. So it's actually so good, they try to ruin George Eastman by all the photographers got together and collectively agreed not to buy his camera so it doesn't put them out of business. This is going to require George Eastman to take a whole different approach to his new camera. So George Eastman creates his own company and sells his cameras directly to the consumer. So what he does is, if you send him $20, he will sell you a camera. You'll get it in the mail. It'll have like 10, 15 pictures that you can take on it. When you take those pictures, you just mail the camera back to him with $5. So you've now spent $25 and don't have anything for it. But George Eastman will develop those pictures, send them back to you with the camera with a new roll of film in it. So instead of spending $100 for one picture, you now drastically have more pictures you can take yourself and it's much more cost effective. Now, you've probably never heard of George Eastman, because there isn't a company called Eastman. I mean, actually there is, but there's not a company called Eastman because he named his company Kodak, which you may have heard of. So Kodak ends up being a huge company in the camera market throughout most of the 20th century and into the 21st century. And the interesting point here is, if you create something cool, name it after yourself, because if he had just named his company Eastman, you probably would have heard of him. But the question here is, explain why George Eastman had to create Kodak instead of just selling his cameras to photographers like he had originally planned. So pause me, answer that completely. We're moving on. All right, so there are two very important guys we're going to talk about right here. Both of these African American men are big supporters of education, of African Americans in education. And it is an issue because there are 9 million black people in the United States. And at the time, and of that 9 million black people, only 3,880 were in college, which is almost a non-existent number out of the 9 million. Not only that, schools were heavily segregated, if not exclusively segregated, across the country. So Booker T. Washington is going to create his own school, the Tuskegee Industrial and Normal Institute, which is an elite school for African Americans. Booker T. Washington saw the racism that was taking place in the United States. So there's this guy, Booker T. Washington, we're talking about right now. We're getting ready to talk about a guy named W.E.B. Du Bois. Both of these African American men strongly support education as the basically tool for African Americans to move up in society. So Booker T. Washington sees all the racism in society attributed to black people at the time. Booker T. Washington's thought process in the late 1800s is, all right, the reason there's so much racism against black people is because black people aren't at that moment contributing to the same to society as white people. And the reason that is because black people were obviously held in slavery and bondage for hundreds of years, and that has just recently ended. So they don't have the same skill sets and the job abilities and you know, the other things, because they weren't allowed to have that during times of slavery. Booker T. Washington is like, as soon as black people, you know, have the same skill sets as white people, all right, in the next generation of people that come through, and black people contribute equally to society as white people, racism on its own is naturally going to end. So Booker T. Washington strives and says that education is the way to really create equality in the United States between black people and white people. Because if everybody's equally educated and equal skill sets, racism will naturally end. Sadly, what we have learned is this is a flawed mentality, because Booker T. Washington, a very intelligent, very logical man, is trying to use logic with an illogical concept of racism. Racism isn't based in logic, because as soon as black people, which did happen, end up having the exact same skill sets as white people, racists do just say, no, they're not. Like, verifiably, black people contribute equally to society as white people. And then racist people are like, no, they don't. You can't argue with just illogic. So while Booker T. Washington's idea that racism will naturally end kind of made sense in the late 1800s, by the time you reach the goals he expected to happen between black people and white people, racism doesn't go away, because he was basing his idea in logic, and racism itself is not a logical concept. So the question here is, when did Booker T. Washington think that racism would end? And what was the flaw in that thinking? As we discovered over time, like, why was that a problem? All right, so let's talk about W.E.B. Du Bois. That is how you pronounce that. It's not Webb Du Bois, it's W.E.B. Du Bois. He is the first African American to receive his doctorate from Harvard. He was extremely intelligent man. This is a picture of him. So W.E.B. Du Bois has a different take on what African Americans should achieve or go through as they move forward in life. He's like, look, 300 years of slavery is awful, and we can all agree that slavery is awful. However, you basically had a breeding program for humans for 300 years to create the best humans possible for work. It stands to reason that when you breed the absolute best people against their will in an evil institution of slavery, when you breed them, you're going to have a superior group of people through the breeding process. So therefore, and he referred to the most talented 1/10 of the population, meaning African Americans. It's like the most talented 1/10 of the population are black people. So black people should not strive to be equal with white people. Black people should strive to be the leaders of American society and make America the greatest country ever. Now, this is in the late 1800s. We're going to talk about some of the segregation and things that are taking place in the South. This is wildly different views than even other people like Booker T. Washington that want black people and white people to be equal. W.E.B. Du Bois says that black people should be leaders in society. Not surprisingly, he gets a lot of backlash from white people at the time because America is incredibly racist in the late 1800s. The idea that black people are better than white people it's so dangerous for him. He literally has to move up near Niagara Falls, which is an upper level of New York. He gets far away from. The further south you go, the more racist it gets. He's up near Niagara Falls. And so people that come visit him and people that support his ideas become referred to as the Niagara Movement, which is this idea that black people should strive to be leaders in the United States and not just put their ceiling at being equal with white people. The NAACP, that's still around today, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, actually originates through the Niagara Movement, which is the idea that black people are to achieve and become leaders in the United States society. So, move out. There's a little picture of the Niagara Falls behind them. So the question here is, why would W.E.B. Du Bois' views of the future of African Americans have been so controversial at the time? So much that he had to move to Niagara Falls. So pause me, answer that completely, and we're moving on. All right. We got to talk about the discrimination in the South, and it's wild. So the reason I say it's wild is this shouldn't happen. There are literal amendments to the Constitution that says you can't discriminate against one group of people over another. The 14th Amendment says everybody is equal. And during the Reconstruction, when this got passed by the radical Republicans, there is a real sense that this has been solved. Racism is over. And then the South completely treats black people as second-class citizens. How do they get away with this? Through something called Jim Crow laws. Jim Crow laws, and Jim Crow is not actually named after an individual person, but Jim Crow laws is the South's sneaky way of keeping black people in an inferior position. So the reason the black codes got thrown out is because the black codes only applied to black people, to African Americans and freedmen and freed slaves. All right. It says, all right, if you're black, here's the laws for you. If you're white, don't worry about these laws. That got thrown out because the 14th Amendment says you can't have specific laws for everybody. Or you can't have specific laws for different groups of people. Everybody has to have the same laws. So the Jim Crow laws, all right, and here's how the South gets away with it. The Jim Crow laws technically apply to everybody, but they're very specifically set up so they only negatively impact black people. All right. So Jim Crow laws technically apply to everybody. It's how they're different from the black codes, but they only impact black people. How so, Mr. Wagstaff? Here's how. Here's some of the most blatant examples of Jim Crow laws. Now, segregation, what was taking place at the time already, the South doesn't really know if that's illegal or not, but they're segregating. You have a white school and a black school. Well, black schools are paid for with taxes from the black side of town, and the white schools are paid for with taxes with the white side of towns. And literally, black people can't live in white neighborhoods, and white people can't live in black neighborhoods. Black people and white people can't marry each other. technically those laws apply to everybody, but what it does is it keeps the poorest part of the community, black people, all right, as a poorest part of the community because their taxes pay for their schools, which aren't as good as the white schools, which is obviously the easiest and most consistent example of how segregation and the Jim Crow laws negatively impacts black communities more than white communities. But let's talk about poll taxes here. A poll tax is you basically have to like pay a nickel to vote. Because the goal is if you can stop black people from voting, white people can control the South. And they're able to effectively do this through these Jim Crow laws, such as a poll tax, which says you have to pay a nickel in order to vote. Well, technically, white people and black people both have to pay this poll tax, but who's the poorest part of society? It's black people who've just gotten out of slavery. So they can't really afford to pay the poll taxes as easily as a white person can. All right? Who, while there's tons of white people, the black people are still poorer generally than even the poor white people. They have to take a literacy test. Now, this is just a picture here of having to pay your poll tax. You have to pay it in advance. Anyway, it's because black people are the poorest part of society, it negatively impacts them the most. But there is a workaround to this, and we'll come back to it. So the literacy test. This is an example of a Louisiana literacy test. Technically, everybody has to take this literacy test. This isn't just, and you might be thinking, okay, well, the schools are worse for black people, so there's a lower literacy rate. Is that what we're getting at? No, look at these questions. This, like number 19, draw in the space below a square with a triangle in it, and within the same triangle, draw a circle with a black dot in it. Number 20, spell backwards, forwards. That seems like what? What? Like, so there's multiple ways of interpreting that question. So whoever's grading it, if it's a black person that takes this literacy test, the person grading it could be like, it's wrong, even if it was right. And if you're a white person, you get it wrong, they'd be like, it's right. They're completely designed to be unfair to keep black people from voting. But here's the biggest one of the Jim Crow laws that applies to everybody. It is called the grandfather clause. So there's some really poor white people that people in the South want to have the ability to vote that won't pay the poll tax. There's also a lot of illiterate white people that can't pass a literacy test at all that the South wants to be able to vote. How do you get them to vote but not black people? So one of the most ridiculous Jim Crow laws that comes out is the grandfather clause. The grandfather clause says, you know what? If your grandfather could vote, you don't have to pay a poll tax or a literacy test. So this law technically applies to everybody. Guess who the only people who had grandfathers that could vote was? White people in the South, because everybody's black grandfathers were slaves. The grandfather clause literally just focuses the poll tax and literacy test just to black people, and white people do not have to pay a poll tax or take a literacy test. And before you think, oh my gosh, that must have been awful down there in Mississippi, Mississippi didn't even pass a grandfather clause. This happens in Virginia, North Carolina, places where racism and segregation is definitely taking place, but not to the extreme violent level that is happening further south. Not that the KKK, we'll come back to later on, not that these terrorist groups don't operate in Virginia and North Carolina, but the further south you get, typically the more insane it gets as far as the treatment of African Americans. But these are, I'll move again, these are the years in which these states all put in poll taxes, literacy test, and grandfather clauses. It's absolutely baffling that this takes place. But what you have done is you've taken away black people's ability to vote. So white supremacist state governments come into place, even in places like Mississippi, all right, who effectively have kept black people from even trying to register to vote. The majority of the state is black, but it is run exclusively by white people, and white people that keep black people as a second-class citizen, even with the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments that's supposed to give everybody equal access under the law. And we're going to reference this again, but this takes place, this doesn't happen for a couple years. This happens for almost a century. It's really not until the Civil Rights Movement of the 1950s with Martin Luther King Jr. that these things start getting fought against at the time. But this is how the South is able to effectively marginalize black people into second-class citizens after Reconstruction. So the question here is, explain the difference between the black codes that took place during Reconstruction and the Jim Crow laws that replaced them. Like, the black codes were, those are illegal, you can't have those. But the Jim Crow laws come out. What's the difference in them? Why are the Jim Crow laws legal, but the black codes were not? So pause me, answer that completely, and we're moving on. All right. So we talk about this in the civics course, and if you guys are having for civics course, we've talked about this. But this is such an important court case in American history. It is worth going really into in civics, and then I want to touch on it here again in U.S. history. There's a court case that takes place in 1896 called Plessy versus Ferguson. All right, it is one of the worst court cases for African Americans in United States history. It basically the federal government acknowledges that segregation is okay. All right, and by doing so. Let me see where I am. So, it says segregation is completely legal in the United States. By doing so, you have relegated black people to second-class citizens. This is the court case that says separate but equal is okay on a federal level. It is awful for black people because just like segregated schools are inherently unequal, and the Supreme Court will come back to this in 1954 during the Civil Rights Movement. One of the things that's going to start the Civil Rights Movement and realize that Plessy versus Ferguson is bullcrap, like this court case. The story behind it is actually crazy. So Homer Plessy is a black man who gets on a train, who buys a first class ticket for a train car, sits on the train, and the conductor comes up to him and says, "Sorry, only white people can sit in the first class section of this train." And Homer Plessy's like, "Oh my gosh." So Homer Plessy is a rich African American. And he's like, "All right, fine. If I have to move back to the black only first class car, where's that at?" And they're like, "Yeah, you're like the first black person we've ever seen that bought a first class ticket. So we don't have a first class car for black people. So you just have to go sit in the regular car in the back with the other black people." So Homer Plessy does. Homer Plessy is furious. Not that he is being discriminated against because he's black, but Homer Plessy is being discriminated against and being forced to sit with the poors. So Homer Plessy is going to sue the railroad company owner, Ferguson, for this injustice of being forced to sit with the poor people. And this is a picture of Homer Plessy suing Ferguson, which I feel like does add something to this story. And you're like, didn't you say one of them was black? Yes. The guy on the left with the beard, that's Homer Plessy. He's an African American. He absolutely could pass for white. But Homer Plessy sues Ferguson, the railroad company owner, and takes it to the Supreme Court. And Homer Plessy says, if you make me go sit in another car of black people, there better be a first class car if I bought a first class ticket. The Supreme Court agrees with Homer Plessy. And they're like, yes, if you segregate them, you have to have equal facilities for both sides. And the Supreme Court in Plessy versus Ferguson says separate but equal. All the South hears from that, though. Guess what's legal, though? Segregation. Instead of saying, no, you can't segregate at all, that's wrong, the Supreme Court says, okay, if you segregate, it has to be equal. It has the very opposite effect because, as the Supreme Court will figure out in 1954, segregation by itself is inherently unequal. So, after Plessy versus Ferguson, this court case, now the South can now legally justify segregating the South. And it's on both sides because they're Jim Crow laws. So this is, if you're white, you literally could not go to black-owned stores. However, since it was on separate sides of town and the funding wasn't the same there, the nicer stuff is going to be on the white side of town. The better jobs are going to be on the white side of town. Generally, better economic prosperity is going to be on the white side of town. But because of Plessy versus Ferguson, it is going to aggressively segregate the United States. All right, so the question here is, explain what Homer Plessy's goal was during the court case and how winning the court case actually backfired on the African American community. So pause me, answer that completely. See you guys tomorrow.